Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Am I in the show? Alhamdulillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Brothers and sisters in Islam, friends and guests, we want to welcome everyone in South Africa, in the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I am your host, coming to you once again from or through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. By the grace of Allah, last week's topic for discussion with two very well-informed brothers with quite a bit of expertise in the field was the epidemic of violence in America's urban centers and what we can do about it. This week, we want to focus a little attention on America's history of crime and punishment, especially as it pertains to the African American community and for the past couple of decades or more on Muslims. This afternoon's, and for South Africa, this evening's conversation will be with my good brother Muhammad Bashir. Brother Muhammad Ibn Bashir is a now retired attorney, formerly licensed to practice law in the state of New Jersey. He was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He graduated from Howard University School of Communications and completed his education at Howard University's Law School. He specialized in criminal and constitutional law and was a sole practitioner for 28 years. During this time, he represented clients in Colorado, Connecticut, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. He has served as a public defender and was co-counsel in the defense of the infamous World Trade Center bombing trial. And we're going to talk a little bit about that during the course of our conversation. As a criminal trial attorney, he had a reputation as a relentless cross-examiner and tenacious advocate. He is the author of a publication, a book by the title of Raw Law, an urban guide to criminal justice. I remember getting that book several years back and really thoroughly enjoying the read. It's a very provocative read. It's a book that was published by Simon and Schuster in 2010. He published, another publication of his is April 4th, Lessons on Living and Dying, published by IN Publishing in 2018, and his just released new book, America in Blackface, Essays and Criticisms of Black Leadership. Another thought-provoking title. He currently serves as CEO at IN Publishing based in Maryland and conducts the broadcast of his criminal and constitutional law-based program, the Raw Law Project, featured on the Heritage Sports Radio Network and Facebook under Raw Law. He is the road manager for the hip-hop band Leftist. Muhammad Ibn Bashir is a motivational lecturer, having lectured in high school and college audiences on criminal justice, mass incarceration, terrorism, and the U.S. Constitution. He also tutors young lawyers on trial tactics and bar exam review. He's married and the father of 5 children. He currently resides in Maryland. My brother, welcome to A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan.
Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, ya habibi. Thank you for having me. Thank you for Salam Media. Again, I'm flattered. I hope I do you justice because I really do admire your work.
MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah. The pleasure is all mine, brother. And speaking on behalf of Salam Media Hours, I'm really, I feel blessed and fortunate to have a brother with your expertise to have a conversation with around these issues that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. And I should note that our brother has another commitment at 3 o'clock. So he's going to have to leave at around 2:50, inshallah ta'ala. And I'm going to wrap it up with some closing thoughts. But without any further ado, question number one to begin this conversation. Machiavelli.
Prince,
the Prince. One of the classic works studied at colleges and universities all over the world, especially throughout the West. And one of his telling observations, he advised the princes, the rulers of his day, on how they could best wage war. And he said that there were two ways of waging war. One is with arms, and the other with law. Spoke of using law as a weapon of war. How does this quote factor into your experience, Aki?
Well, actually, all right. So let me do it on a historical in a historical framework as it relates to the law. In order for you to enslave a people, in order for you to dominate a people, you have to bring them under control. It's just not a matter of forces, equal forces, or even unequal forces battling. It's in order for you to gain victory, you have to bring a particular force under control, under submission. That's how you gain your victory. How do you bring them under control? What has been historic, at least in the Western Hemisphere, at least since 1250, when the Europeans began to remove the Islamic presence in Europe, is the rewriting of laws to target a particular culture, a particular community. If you recall, back then, the Moors were controlling most of Europe, and the battles were back and forth. So about 1250, the Europeans began to seize control, began to push the Moors back. And so therefore, if you were what they considered to be a black or Moor, then as they began to push you out, they also began to say you can stay, but the new rule is you have to convert. If you were a Jew, you had to convert. So it began to become part and parcel of the law, of the doctrine, to be able to say this is part of how we are going to control. So we control by virtue of, even though we may get the victory on the battlefield, the victory on the battlefield doesn't always translate into control. Control translates into establishing systems and then having the ability or to articulate it and to enforce it by way of law. Now let's jettison out of Europe over here to the continental United States. The most important document that we talk about in America is the United States Constitution. It's considered to be the supreme law of the land. What it is, frankly, is a mechanism of control. And it's a mechanism of control it's the old Malcolm expression that if you are black and you're not thinking black at this late date, I feel sorry for you. Well, I want everybody to look at it as control over those people who the culture feels needs to be controlled. Because again, what they do with the law is they target an area in the law that they believe can control the people and benefit the oligarchs, but benefit the people in power. And it becomes pretty simple when you look at it like that. So, for example, if you were an indentured servant, white European indentured servant, and you were a black indentured, somebody who was either converted to slavery or you became a slave once you were brought here. All right. The rules had to be we have to control this. And so therefore laws, direct laws were instituted to separate those two groups. Direct laws were instituted to put one group in charge of another group. The direct laws were put in to define particular groups and what they could do. This is what the concept of white supremacy began to institute. You place one group at the top, and then everybody falls within a category up underneath it, as long as there's a bottom level category. And that's why you see the concept of chattel enslavement, because there had to be a bottom level class that you could say they have, as they said in Dred Scott, you have no right that a white man is bound to respect. So they institute law as a way of controlling the people. Thus, when you win the war physically, you're able to win the war intellectually, and you're able to control the people. So that's really what law does. And if you have that definition, and you look at any law in the United States, especially criminal or constitutional, you look at it from the aspect of who it intends to control, then you get a full understanding of what the United States has been and continues to be about.
Okay, with that in mind, I want to share with you a quote from the late New York State Supreme Court Justice Bruce Wright. And you give me your thoughts on this quote as it pertains to the African American community today. He said, quote, "For those of the inner city, as our dark enclaves are so euphemistically called, the judges are the assembly line feeders of the prison system. Those in the system, whether prisoners, jailers, or judges, who dare to speak of rehabilitation are regarded as wild-eyed speculators about the human spirit. They are accused of having more concern for the criminal than for the victims of crime. This abandonment of concepts of rehabilitation leads to society's preoccupation only with custody. This results in the warehousing of offenders. The mean neighborhoods from which they come are neighborhoods transferred into prisons." End quote.
That's from
Justice Bruce Wright.
Yeah, I know the quote because I know the man. I had the opportunity to meet the man when I was practicing. Giant. They used to call him Cut Him Loose Bruce up in New York.
Yes, they did.
But a giant. He was, in fact, a sidebar. He was the one who inspired raw law. Having read his book,
Black Robes, White Justice.
Black Robes, White Justice inspired me to write, because the anger that was building inside of me over what I was now seeing, the idealistic young man coming out of law school thinking he could change the system, what I was seeing, he articulated in that book. And so to get the anger off of me, I wrote Raw Law. In any event, let's go back to the definition that I gave you and the definition that he gave you. And the common theme about that is the control. All right. See, because what we have been taught in the culture is that lofty language, the ideal, must be what America is about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Lofty ideal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Lofty ideal that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When we hear that about America, we think, wow, how lofty is that as an ideal? Now, point to a black man in America, in the history of America, who has been able to say all men are created equal, and it has been sustained by the culture as it relates to any black man. That where the culture thought him as being him or her as being equal, because the very first people who wrote that were writing that and eliminating black people as part of that consideration. This is what the judge is referring to. He's talking about the issue that these people who come across and say rehabilitation should matter, they're talking from a moral and a realistic standpoint of what's going on the ground, that people can be rehabilitated, that people can have a moral center, that the culture should have a moral center. But the people who deal with the ideal say, look, that's just an ideal. We want control, because if we give up the control, we give up the power. We won the war, so we need the control. We don't need egalitarianism. We don't need morality as the basis of our functioning. And that therein lies the dynamic that you have if you are an African American. See, you are locked into a reality where your morality steps forward each and every day. This is why you can create a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is why you can create a Malcolm X. They're always talking from a moral paradigm. There's an old quote by one of your favorite people, Jamil Abdul Alameen, when he was H. Rap Brown. He was talking about nationalism. He said that the Chinese should think of nationalism, the Puerto Ricans should think of nationalism, the black man should think of nationalism. He said the white man, then he paused and he said, well, he should be more humane. And therein lies your dynamic. The question that is always going to exist in America is, are we a moral culture or are we a structured culture? And can structure and morality come together? We, as a community, that is the people who actually need the culture to change toward a moral stance, are the people who are saying rehabilitation works. Defund the police and turn certain aspects over to the community for the community to be able to come out with their doctors, their social workers, their psychologists to be able to handle many of the tasks that are now being thrown at the feet of those people who only are there for purposes of control. Policing in America, military in America are only in the position to be the enforcement arm of the other systems. And I say enforcement, I don't mean rehabilitation. Has nothing to do with policing. Protect and serve has nothing to do with policing. It's just a slogan. They are there as the enforcement arm of other systems that benefit from their enforcement. The culture has to learn how to benefit from the morality of people working together to help other people. Rehab, things like that are part of the moral dynamic, but it's not part of the control dynamic.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested to hear your perspective, for you to share some of your perspective from the experience you had, my brother, the insights that you gleaned from your involvement in the 1996 World Trade Center bombing case. Mm-hmm. I've been arguing for years, that what we're seeing today in terms of this heavy-handed and fundamentally unjust approach to the Muslim community is not something that just began post 9/11.
Right.
There were indications of this, very clear indications of this prior to 9/11, and that World Trade Center bombing case is an example of that. And I'm reminded of something that Bill Kunstler said, and I'm sure that you knew him as well.
Yes.
In his book, My Life as a Radical Lawyer, I had an opportunity of having a very in-depth conversation with him about one of the chapters in that book, The Despised Muslim. Mm-hmm. He said, and if I can remember the quote precisely from that chapter, he said, today, Muslims are the most hated group in America. The moment a Muslim is accused of a crime, the specter of terrorism is raised and everyone panics. And that's how he basically began that chapter. Then he went into a number of case studies that he had been involved in. You were involved in the 1996 World Trade Center bombing case. What are the insights, some of the insights that you gleaned from that experience, from being exposed to that very political case, and how does it relate to what unfolded in the United States post 9/11?
Let me tell you about that chapter and that quote. While you were questioning him about that, we were debating him about that. Mm-hmm. That quote that the Muslims are the most hated. And here's why. Historically, the narrative hasn't changed. Just the naming has changed. Mm-hmm. What happens is we as a culture, especially in the so-called black community, we get locked into periods as opposed to continuums. You understand what I'm saying? It was the 60s, right, as opposed to it's America. America is a continuum. So the first people who were brought over here are labeled slaves. All right? Meaning that their rights and their privileges and their language is taken away from them. The next group of people that they encounter, who are probably ancestrally connected to these slaves that they're bringing over are labeled savages, given the word. And so now the mindset of the people coming here is that you have savages and you have people of no value. You got less than humans and savages. These are the people that you're dealing with. If you look at your Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, one of the complaints that he had when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, by the way, our people only read the preamble. We don't really read the whole declaration, but he had like 20 complaints. One of them is where he actually says, you left us here with these savages. He's talking about the so-called Native Americans. So words are part and parcel of the control and part and parcel of white supremacy. Now, let's take that and jettison it up all the way through history, because I see your mind is going, you're thinking about all the different labels that were placed on Black people and other people as they come over. Chinese, gooks, this, that, and the third, all this kind of stuff. So we get up to the World Trade Center bombing. One of the things that you have to recall on the World Trade Center bombing is it's right on the heels of a couple of three things. It's on the heels of the domestic crack powder war on drugs, and it's on the heels of the end of the Vietnam War, as well as the end of the so-called Cold War. So now you have and no enemy in a culture that needs an enemy in order to maintain control. See, one of the things that the civil rights movement did when it shook up the world was it brought people together of all cultures, religions, persuasions to say something is wrong with our culture. Led by voices like King, led by voices like Snick, led by voices like Malcolm. Something is wrong with our culture. So then therefore they had to find a way around it. And what they do is when they don't have an enemy, they'll create an enemy. This is why Indians became savages. This is why slaves became 3/5 of a human being. This is why Chinese became gooks. This is why your Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s. You don't have an enemy. The government needs to create an enemy in order for them to be able to get off a control agenda. And that's really what it's about. In order for you to keep this power, you have to be able to control the people, and you do it mentally, emotionally, and you use these code words to get at them. No, better dead than red. Remember that expression? Ushered into McCarthyism, right?
Yes.
All right. This is the kind of stuff that they do, period after period. So when they are messing in Afghanistan, a place they really belong, with this Mujahideen or whatever it is that later becomes something called Al-Qaeda or something like that, they are really looking for an enemy. So when the whole thing goes up, what I found out during the entirety of the World Trade Center bombing case, the most important aspect of it to me was the consistency of the government in defining how they would move and how easy it is for them to create an enemy. The word terrorism became uniquely associated with Muslims. So when I tell Kunstler that he says that Muslims are the most hated people, no, they are the most immediate enemy, the most immediately hated people. But Black people have never stopped being hated in America, even to the point to where some Black people hate being Black. It's part and parcel of the culture. But this time, the enemy was going to be, we have to move into the Middle East internationally and begin to control the oil internationally. We have to come off the tail end of the Arabs attempting to embargo oil from us. And we had that debacle of the going back and forth and having to get your gas and on Tuesdays and Fridays and all that kind of stuff. So we had to assert our power somewhere there. So we created that enemy and we called them a terrorist. And so therefore but we did better than that. See, it became Muslim because there became a slogan called something called fundamentalism. Remember that expression?
Yes.
Now it's morphed into jihadist or something along that line. So it's constantly a redefining to create that fear in the populace so that they would allow the government to use control. And that's what I saw, and that's what stuck with me most about that particular trial. Regardless of that it lasted 6 months, regardless of all the evidence that was brought in that was questionable or non-questionable, regardless of what the verdict was, or even the bombing and the deaths of the people. Nobody deserves to die But
Mm-hmm.
at the core of it was a revelation for me that here we are again using a political event to redefine who the enemy is going to be so that we could maintain control over something else. This time it turned out to be Middle Eastern and North African oil and politics. And this is what it was used for. So the word terrorism became intimately linked with Muslims, and therefore Muslim communities like Somalia, Iraq, Iran, Syria. You can see the dominoes beginning to fall, just like they said they would in the new American century. You can see them all go right back to 1993 in the World Trade Center bombing case, and boom, you jettison all the policies that come right after that, and you see the redefining of Muslims, and then the internment of policies that directly relate to control coming directly out of the words and the verbiage that they use to define these people.
Alhamdulillah, and I'm glad you corrected the year. It was 1993.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, Brother Muhammad, with that being said, clearly, you know, what we're seeing today, this trend and how the law is being used as a weapon of war, this continuous trend, and the way that it is morphing from one thing into another, in a continuum, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
It brings us to the next question. What are your thoughts on some of the major cases involving Muslims post 9/11? And in fact, Imam Jamil's case, he's one of the cases I want to reference. His actually took place before 9/11. His was in March of 2000. That's when his case began. But
Yeah.
he had been targeted for a number of years in different ways, leading up to that tragedy on the west end of Atlanta in March of 2000. So, but these major cases involving Muslims, Imam Jamil Abdullah Alameen, Dr. Afia Siddiqui, the sister who came from Pakistan when she was just an 18-year-old, graduating with honors from MIT and Brandeis, and then being labeled as as someone suspected of having ties to Al Qaeda, and being targeted after she left the United States and went back home for a rendition operation that had her and her children missing for 5 years before they resurfaced her and then brought her back to the United States, where she has been ever since. So we've got Imam Jamil, we've got Dr. Afia Siddiqui, we've got the Holy Land 5 case. That was the first major terrorism case involving a charity that was the largest Muslim charity in the United States, doing phenomenal work. Then you have this multitude, never-ending and ever-growing multitude of preemptive prosecution cases involving young Muslims. What are your thoughts on all of this, Aki?
Remember what I told you, there were two concepts that we're going to constantly refer to, at least I'm going to constantly refer to, and that is control and
Yes.
the continuum.
Yes.
All right. So now I'm just going to start you with, let's just start with the 60s. All right. And see if we can get to understand how the Muslims fit into this control and to this continuum.
Okay.
Because Malcolm is when you talk to especially immigrant Muslims, the only Muslim they really know is Malcolm X. I mean, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and they might remember that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf were Muslims, all right? So, I mean, no disrespect to them, but when you come to it, if I go to the Hajj, I should know what the Hajj rules are. So when you come to America, you should know what America is like. And the best way to find out if you're Muslim is to talk to a Muslim who's in America. And believe me, the Muslim in America will tell you from the underbelly to the top, because we've seen it all, right?
Yes.
All right. So take El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. What does he attempt to do that no other American tried to do before his time? Now, I'm not talking about Robeson going to the UN with William Patterson to charge genocide. I'm talking about trying to unite Africa, that is Muslim Africa, Black Africa, with Muslim America, Black America. Bring the two together, right? But why? because there's a concept that exists that has never been defeated. Even though they've been pushed out and beaten down, every time you push it down somewhere, because Allah's decree is what? He will make it rise up above. No matter where, no matter you push it down somewhere, Allah raises up the Muslim someplace else. And sometimes he raises up the Muslim who will be better than the Muslim that came before it.
Right.
So now, in order for you to control in the early 1200s, in order for you to control the people, you had to what? Suppress Islam. So one of the things that they began to do in their doctrine, in their laws, would say that you could be free if you converted to Catholicism or if you converted to Protestantism. But you had to convert, you had to declare yourself a Christian in order to do that. Same thing here, 1963. The same people who you're trying to convert in 1200 are the people who are now resurfacing here in America. They are now coming in by virtue of the Civil Rights Movement. They're coming from around the world. That Immigration Act that comes in, that opens the door to many of the Muslims who are here now. When I was a kid, there were very few. There was a place called New York called the World Habitat. And you could, I don't think people really were trying to get into America, but they couldn't. You had to have money, you had to have family, you had to have a whole bunch of other things. But now, almost any person can come in. You had to come from Lebanon and change your name from Dawood to Danny, something like that.
Yeah.
Look, I'm telling you what I observed.
Yeah.
But when you get here and you begin to deal with the cases, look and see what the cases are attempting to do politically. And remember the continuum and the control. These cases are all based on something commonly referred to as terrorism. And they always, in order for it to be terrorist, they have to link it to a foreign occupation, a foreign doctrine. You can't have, there's nothing in the statute called domestic terrorism, even though we constantly discuss it. We don't know why they don't charge these guys who shoot up churches and the guys who come out with AK-47s and shoot down 50 people and 50 little kids in a school. They're not charged as domestic terrorists because there's no such thing as a domestic terrorist. It has to be connected to some foreign entity. Look and see where the foreign entities are. You're talking about places like things like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, ISIS, all mysteriously linked to UN policy or UN dollars, US dollars. So you get to create the fire and then show up with the fire hydrant. So when you look back, like the couple of brothers in New York, right? They come out, they're new Muslims, etc. And a guy saying we need to get these Jews, and we're gonna burn down their masjid. Here, I'll give you a couple $100 if you come with me. He turns out to be an FBI agent. The headlines read, "Terrorists plot to burn," right? The charity that you're talking about, right? The Holy Land Foundation. What is it doing? It's trying to create opportunities for charitable donations, which is a pillar in Islam. It is an obligation in Islam that you give charity. But they have organized the charity. So then what's the best way to shut down that pillar of Islam is to shut down the people who are taking that charity and making it work somewhere. Like Yemen.
Yes.
Like Syria. You get to say, wait a minute, there's somebody on their board who's connected to Al-Qaeda or ISIL. Or, they got so many names out there now that they keep saying are Muslim organizations. But again, it connects you to that international connection of an organization that was labeled as a terrorist, and then gives you the opportunity to say terrorism, that code word that sparks fear in everybody's heart. Nowhere near anything like what's going on here with white nationalism, but still the international connection locks you in. So all of these cases, I'm telling you, from the top to the very bottom, all have the same or similar connection to it. Government sponsorship with control at the beginning, the continuum of being able to label a particular group, and then the ability to say, now, this is directly associated with Muslims. So whenever you think of Muslim, you think terrorism. Whenever you think of terrorism, you think of evil. And then therefore you can treat Muslims the way you want to treat them in the law. And that helps you to control a Muslim. Same thing they do with black people for 400 years.
What is your perspective, Aki, on from me, my humble perspective, this is an unprecedented moment this country is in terms of the pressure that's being brought to bear from the streets. I've never seen anything like this, certainly on this level, where there is this enormous focus on not just the way policing has been traditionally done in this country, but on the whole system of of law in general. There's just this enormous focus and this enormous pressure coming from the streets and coming from one of the most diverse uprisings of folk throughout the country that I've ever seen. But it is all rooted in this Black Lives Matter principle, which is a principle. This is a movement that predates the organization by this name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on what we're seeing today in the United States in the name of Black Lives Matter?
I think it's probably one of the, I think we're in a very profound moment. But again, we're in a profound moment that is part of the continuum.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when Richard Nixon was president, and maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, somebody interviewed Ehrlichman, and he said, did we know the war on drugs was a fake? Yes, we did.
Mm-hmm.
But we needed it to criminalize the liberals with marijuana and the blacks with heroin.
Mm-hmm.
So we needed it. Now, what was profound about that? Again, see, because again, we look at it in terms of time and place instead of the continuum. All right. But if you take that statement and put it in the continuum, then you get a chance to see. What Richard Nixon's guy was saying is that this is how easy it is to criminalize a particular group of people and how easy it is to make sure that we put laws in place to be able to continue our control over the people. What you're seeing, what they were saying, what he was saying was that back in the 60s, in the 50s, it was black people by themselves, fighting, struggling, etc. All of a sudden, they began to turn water hoses on black people. All of a sudden, it began to hit the nightly news with Walter Cronkite because this is what was going on to black people.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, Muhammad Ali said, "I'm not going to Vietnam. Ain't no Viet Cong call me nigger."
Mm-hmm.
And white America finally began to see what black America had been talking about for 200 years. I mean, think about it. Go back to Frederick Douglass' 4th of July speech. What does he say? Are you trying to mock me by inviting me here? A culture that has committed more crimes than a nation of savages. This is what he's saying to the people who invite him to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't see me because they didn't. But now, in the 60s, they are seeing it on Walter Cronkite. And so now they're coming out. This is not the America that I know.
Mm-hmm.
So they began to come out into the streets. Your Goodmans, your Schwerners, they begin to come out into the streets. Your Rabbi Herschels, they begin to come out into the streets because this is not the America that they know, nor the America they want to see. Your Kent States, they begin to come out and protest, right? Your anti-war movement. Muhammad Ali says, "I'm not going." See, because before there was a movement, they was running off to Canada. When Muhammad Ali spoke up, they began to burn their draft cards.
Mm-hmm.
But now everybody's home. The confluence of Corona, the confluence of unemployment, the need, the necessity that the government's saying stay home. And in the middle of that, you have at least 3 publicized and observed borderline lynchings, where mobs chase down black men and kill them. Arbery in Georgia, Floyd in
Minnesota,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
then there's another brother who was shot down, I think, in Georgia as well, running from a guy with a taser in his hand or something.
Right.
You get to see it. The people are literally home watching it again.
Mm-hmm.
And they're thinking with Obama that we have gotten past racism, even though Trump might be the epitome of white nationalism. But for them, that's nothing. That's, that doesn't impact me until you see the America as man of color has been trying to describe it to you for 400 years again. And a whole new generation now has the opportunity to see it. And that's what you're seeing out there in the streets. The confluence, the same kind of confluence, is just at a bigger scale. That happened there. And guess who's getting labeled as the enemy again?
Mm-hmm.
White liberals. They're calling them what? Antifa, anarchists, right? They're calling lock arm moms in Portland, Oregon, where there's only 6% black population. They got more black people on the basketball team, the Portland Trailblazers, than they do in the whole city of Portland. But the white moms are locking arms because that's not the America that they were brought up, raised, and taught about, where the government just knocks down 75-year-old white men on the street for protesting, for peacefully protesting, throws little white girls down on the street and smashes their skull because she's standing with black people, runs people off with horses and tear gas at the White House so that the president can take a picture. That's not the America that they grew up learning about. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to see their America destroyed. Their America. No, that's not America. I literally was in a conversation with a lawyer. He on Facebook, and he's like, when he saw what was going on in Portland, he said, "This is not America." And I had to say, sadly, it's the America I've seen for 400 years. What are you talking about? Mm-hmm. It just means that now this confluence hopefully will continue, because if you look at Portland, if Portland is the test case of what the people are doing, it says that still the vast majority of them are so-called white American, protesting and still shouting out Black Lives Matter, trying to get the point across that these people have, I can see why they're complaining. I can see why black people have a complaint. And I'm for correcting this injustice in all the systems. Because again, if you look at that case, just that case alone, you got police brutality, you got deliberate indifference to the public and the media, you got misleading information from the various branches of government, executive, legislative, and the judicial, on what to do with that particular case. You got a guy with a $20 bill. It demonstrates control versus morality. Who gets killed over a $20 bill? This is what people are seeing. They're seeing every aspect of their system being challenged, especially the thing that they hold most dear in this culture, other than the Bible, which is the Constitution, the right to peacefully protest. And they're like, no, you can't beat me up for protesting. This is America. And so that's what they're seeing. And Black Lives Matter as a slogan is starting to resonate because, again, people are starting to say, wait a minute, maybe these people are right. Maybe their lives just don't matter to this particular government. And so I have to, if I say I'm an American, if I say I stand for justice, if I say I believe in right in opposition to wrong, I have to stand in order to defend America, let alone defending black people. And this is what you're seeing. This is what you saw historically with John Brown. This is what you saw historically with Quakers. This is what you saw historically with the civil rights movement. And this is what you're seeing historically now. You're just seeing a whole new generation that's a little bit more fired up, and they're going to be labeled as the enemy too. And hopefully they're ready for the backlash because it's coming. And I guess you can see them sending federal agents into various communities. But didn't they send federal agents on the border in 2018 to do the exact same thing they're doing now? You know, they labeled them the enemy. Remember, the caravan is coming, it's invading our country.
Yes, yeah.
To stroke that level of fear. They were invaders, a new word to use to describe Latins trying to seek asylum from the torture and the drug wars that are going on in their country that were precipitated by NAFTA and the United States foreign policy. They were labeled as invaders. A new word to give the world like, oh my God, invaders. What does that mean? Remember back in, you're probably old enough to remember, historically, I wasn't old enough to see it, but War of the Worlds was blasted on the radio. Orson Welles, and he gets up and he starts talking about an invasion from outer space. And literally, people began to jump out of windows believing that they were being invaded from outer space because of the believability of his statement. That's the fear that's what's inside of them that shows you how easily they respond to a fear. And every government agency and every government operative has learned to stroke that fear in an effort to move their agenda forward. And so I hope and I pray that these people understand that it's bigger than just your protest. It's about breaking down the continuity and then moving forward collectively. You know, so if they're just there to protect their Constitution, which is what I argue as relates to John Brown, he wasn't there for a revolution for black people. He was there to free slaves because he was anti-slavery. But if the slaves wanted to have revolution and fight for their freedom, that wasn't his goal. You know, he said it in his own speech at his trial. His goal wasn't to see violence. His goal was to just free some slaves and get them up into Canada. And therein lies part of our dilemma. If we see Black Lives Matter as liberation, and another culture joins us as Black Lives Matter to defend the Constitution and to defend the culture, can there be a confluence to where the defense of the Constitution and the liberation of the people come together to create a movement that leads to more and better justice in the culture?
Final question, Akeem. Accountability is a two-way street. As we strive to hold the engineers and functionaries of an oppressive system accountable, we must also hold ourselves accountable. In your opinion, what are some of the most important things within our power to control that we should be doing?
Okay. That's such an excellent question considering these times, because I can't even tell you how many times people ask me, what do you think about black on black crime? Like that's separate and apart from the continuum.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm going to give you a list of things that I think we can do. First of all, there is no doctrine. There is no blueprint that I have read or seen for rehabilitation of the soul, like La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I think if we're Muslims and we refuse to step forward and assert La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah and then practice it the way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam authored for us, the way he encouraged us, the way the Sahaba encouraged us, that is with forgiveness in our heart, but firmness in our stance, with debating with hikmah, with wisdom, with that is wanting for your brother what you want for yourself, that is kindness to your neighbor, all the things that with the goal toward we can get to paradise on this. And would I turn away from a bad deed because I know that turning away will get me to paradise? If we can begin to think along those lines, just put that in our mind and begin to step everywhere we step with those things on our mind, putting deen first, then we can begin to implement some of the things that I think will change us. The first one being, we have to not be afraid of our kids. Our kids are there looking for one thing, and that's an education. Can you imagine what it's like as a kid who is about ready to kill someone? Like, I mean, he's a gangbanger. Let's assume he's a gangbanger. Mm-hmm. If he knew that that gang was created by the government to get him, do you think he would still be a gangbanger? If he knew that the war on drugs in '68 was declared by Richard Nixon to get black people, and you are falling into that trap, if he understood the history behind that, do you think he would still do it? I mean, there'll be some knuckleheads who think I can get around it because the culture tells me you can get around it. You can be Jay-Z. You know what I mean? You can hustle. That's why they put things like power and empire on the screen so that you can think you can get around it. When the real goal is to incarcerate and to enslave again under the 13th Amendment as many black people as you can. Mm-hmm. So if we are going to change this, we have to begin to not fear our kids. 2, not fear educating our kids. 3, not fear black scholarship. You know what we do as Muslims? We'll run to Imam Ghazali and forget that there was a Francis Welsing who lived in America. You know what I mean? So somewhere there can be a merger between the two. The scholarship is scholarship. If she's a psychologist and he's an imam, then I want the imam. But I also want the scholarship on what racism, white supremacy means. And we can't be afraid to put the two together in a meaningful way that allows us to educate. Because everybody tells you education is the key. The problem is we allow ourselves to send our kids to public school and get that education, so they get indoctrinated into self-hate. And therefore, when you talk about accountability, what does that mean to them? What does that really mean to them? And that's really what our problem is. So as far as I'm concerned, the key to this is, 1, we as Muslims have to hold on to our deen. 2, we were sent here as to be a middle nation, so we should be in the middle of everything. 3, we should educate our kids and then therefore educate every community around here as to what the blueprint for unity and struggle really is, because we have unity and struggle in our house. And then we have to go ahead and implement an educational policy that says this is how we do it, and we'll be willing to defend it with our voices, with our hands, with our heart.
Alhamdulillah, my brother Muhammad ibn Bashir, this has been a really a wonderful conversation, brother. I have thoroughly enjoyed it myself, and I'm sure that the audience has as well. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to have you back for another one. But before we close, would you like to say something very quickly? We're at the 2:52 hour now. Would you like to say something very quickly about your books? So people can know. Yes, inshallah ta'ala.
April 4th, Lessons on Living and Dying. You can contact me at m-7@hotmail.com and get that. Raw Law, An Urban Guide to Criminal Justice is Simon and Schuster publication. You can get that anywhere. The other ones are self-published. I decided not to go the corporate route, and America in Blackface is now ready. You can pre-order it. You can, again, at m-7@hotmail.com. And again, brother, thank you so much. These are conversations that we absolutely have to have, and I pray that we continue to have them, and we continue to try our best to educate ourselves and educate our community, because with education, the kind of education that liberates, we're going to win.
Alhamdulillah. May Allah ta'ala bless you, brother. Inshallah ta'ala, we will have you back soon, inshallah ta'ala. Thank you again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Stay strong, you hear?
Yes, indeed. Inshallah ta'ala. Wa alaikum salam. Brothers and sisters, we have some minutes left on the on our time for this broadcast, and so what I want to do is share something that is connected with the conversation that we had last week with our two esteemed brothers, Brother Khalid and Brother Rashad, and the conversation that we just had this afternoon with our brother Muhammad Bashir. This book that was just recently released, published, alhamdulillah, by the Afia Foundation, and available on Amazon and directly from us, of course. The imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, the former H. Rap Brown, is it a government conspiracy? I want to share something with you in our remaining minutes from the prologue. I want to share with you the prologue. But before we get into the prologue, and we're going to go a little over the 3 o'clock hour, but it will be, I'm sure you will find it to be time well spent. First, the introduction. March 16th, 2020 marks 20 years since the tragedy unfolded in Atlanta, Georgia, that would have a traumatic impact on many lives. Today, Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, the former H. Rap Brown, is prisoner number 99974-555 in a federal institution in Tucson, Arizona. It should be noted that for most of these years, Imam Jamil, as he is commonly known, a state prisoner, was housed in the federal government's only supermax prison located in Florence, Colorado. While he no longer resides in that facility, he still remains under special administrative measures, imprisonment conditions which continue to take a toll on his health. The case of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, Is It a Government Conspiracy?, was first published in 2002 as a small booklet in the aftermath of what masqueraded as a fair trial in downtown Atlanta. Our intent in publishing the booklet was to brief concerned folk around the nation on the substance of his case. The booklet has been out of print for a number of years, but the struggle for justice continues. Those of us who believe in Imam Jamil's innocence felt the need to reissue the publication with more exculpatory evidence for the court of public opinion to consider. The imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, Is It a Government Conspiracy?, is now a small book with other voices brought into the mix beyond my own. Through this updated treatise, we pray that many of the readers unfamiliar with the life and legacy of Imam Jamil, the former H. Rap Brown, will gain a deeper appreciation for who he is, a deeper sensitivity for where he is, and a deeper awareness of how he came to be where he is. After that, let your own conscience be your guide. Now, this was my introduction to this book. What I want to do now is just share the prologue. Just share the prologue of the book, which is actually taken from another book uh, authored by Imam Jamil El-Amin before some years before his wrongful imprisonment, a book entitled Revolution by the Book. This is the prologue um, from Revolution by the Book. And this prologue was authored by, I believe it was authored by my brother Mario Abdul Salam Ahmed. The following prologue, with a few minor modifications, is republished here courtesy of Writers Inc., publishers of Revolution by the Book, a thought-provoking treatise on the fundamental tenets of Islam, authored by Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, the former H. Rap Brown. In the late 1960s, he was known as H. Rap Brown, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And some of you, no doubt, most of you are probably aware of the fact that one of the other prominent figures from SNCC, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, has just passed, former Congressman John Lewis. He was then, he became also, he received the ceremonial title, Minister of Justice of the Black Panther Party, and as someone who made the FBI's most wanted list. He later became known as Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, Imam or spiritual leader of an international Muslim community based in Atlanta, Georgia. As a Muslim leader, Imam Al-Amin is recognized for his dedication to the principles of the Holy Quran and the tradition of Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. He frequently spoke at universities and Islamic organization conferences and conventions. More than 17 communities throughout North America and the Caribbean pledged allegiance to his leadership. After a lifetime of involvement in the struggle of African American people for justice and liberation, the commitment of Imam Al-Amin never wavered. He stated, quote, "The struggle is an ongoing process. Many times, people mistakenly identify movement as struggle. Movement is only a phase of struggle. When the first slave rebelled against being a slave, he gave an alternative to slavery that has been built upon until now. That struggle, and there have been many movements in the struggle. The abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, the civil rights movement, the free speech movement. And on this note, let me just say parenthetically that our brother, our guest today, he spoke about the continuum. This is what Imam Jamil is referencing here, this continuum of movements. He went on to say, it means they come, they serve a purpose, and they go out. We grew to understand that it was a vehicle that moved people from one level of understanding to another level. The civil rights movement had to go out. It's ridiculous today to try to relive it, but the struggle still goes on. The mission of a believer in Islam is totally different from coexisting or being a part of the system. The prevailing morals are wrong. Their ethics are wrong. Western philosophy has reduced man to food, clothing, shelter, and the sex drive, which means he doesn't have a spirit. In Islam, we're not talking about getting the poor to vote. We're not talking about empowering poor people with money. We're talking about overturning that whole thing, man. End quote. Now, this was a quote that was cited in an interview that was done in the city paper. There was a special profile that was on Imam Jamil on January 12th, 1992. The prologue goes on to say, Brown, the youngest of three children, was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1943. His father worked as a laborer for Esso Standard Oil. His mother taught children at an orphanage and also worked as a maid. As a youth, the 5-inch Brown was an excellent athlete, excelling in basketball and football. After graduating from high school, he attended Southern University in Baton Rouge, but did not find the school a place with which he could identify. It was apparent to Brown that an insidious reality existed all around him, but went unmentioned. Quote, he said, "It was from watching white people, what they had and what we had, that I learned about this country." He wrote in his part autobiography, part political handbook, Die Nigger Die. He went on to say, quote, "I lived near Louisiana State University and I could see this big, fine school with modern buildings, and it was for whites. Then there was Southern University, which was about to fall in, and that was for the blacks. And when I compared the two, the message that the white man was trying to get across was obvious. Die, nigger, die." Brown states that he knew who I wanted to identify with. It was the Bloods in my neighborhood, the guys who hung out on the block or down on the corner. I always hung out with cats who had made hanging out a profession. I found that it took special skills to hang out for 14 hours just laying and playing, end quote. The name given to him by his parents, and again, this is another quote from Die Nigger Die. The name given to him by his parents was Hubert Gerard Brown. The street named him Rap. He had a scathing dexterity with the language, combining profound intellect and blunt coarseness. He said, "We played the dozens like white folks play Scrabble, a mean game where you try to totally destroy somebody else with words," end quote. Influenced by his readings of many writers committed to the struggle of blacks for freedom, the 19-year-old H. Rap Brown found the environment around Howard University in Washington, D.C. inspiring and motivating. He had spent summers there with his older brother, the late Ed Brown, who attended Howard, and by 1964, Brown had moved there and become politically involved in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC, in the early 1960s, had initiated peaceful protests and demonstrations to accelerate desegregation in the South. In 1964, SNCC promoted the Mississippi Project, in which 800 volunteers helped thousands of blacks register to vote. Under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, SNCC in 1966 rejected its earlier dissuading whites rejected its earlier policy of nonviolence. It adopted a strong anti-white direction, dissuading whites from participating in the organization and disdaining their support. As chairman of SNCC, Carmichael criticized many of the tactics of the civil rights movement and demanded black power for his people. Brown's boldness and commitment were soon recognized by the SNCC leadership. He was sent by Carmichael into Alabama to organize the state. Wrote Brown of those efforts, quote, "At first, we just spent our time going to meetings and getting to know the people. Up in Greene County, we used to starve like dogs. The house we lived in didn't have running water, and it had newspapers on the walls and the floors," end quote. H. Rap Brown's reputation and influence grew rapidly. He took on the political establishment with fearless verbal assaults that moved and inspired audiences. He helped break the spell which years of slavery and segregation had cast over the African American masses who held white leaders in awe and reverence. In May 1967, at the age of 23, he was elected chairman of SNCC, succeeding Stokely Carmichael. Newsweek magazine described the new chairman as, quote, "a disenchanted ex-poverty worker who affects sunglasses indoors and out, a droopy mustache, a bushy natural coif, and a curdled view of the white world. He preaches armed eye for an eye self-defense for Negroes and packs a 12 gauge cracker gun in his own dusty Plymouth. End quote. A national figure. H. Rap Brown was in great demand as a speaker. In July 1967, he addressed a civil rights rally in Cambridge, Maryland, an eastern shore town of approximately 13,000 people. Brown arrived late, and a crowd had already gathered in the streets of the city's black neighborhood, along with a contingent of police and National Guardsmen, kind of like what we're seeing today. A national figure, reportedly, Brown addressed the crowd in his usual fiery style from the hood of a parked car. He stormed, quote, "Take your violence to the hunkies. You've got to get some guns. Burn and tear Cambridge down. If Cambridge doesn't come around, burn it down. Get yourselves some guns. The town is ready to explode. If you don't have guns, don't be here. You have to be prepared to die," end quote. After I spoke, people were just milling around. This is, again, a quote from H. Rap Brown. After I spoke, people were just milling around. A young lady who lived up towards Race Street, where a bunch of white policemen were, asked me to walk her home because she was afraid to go by herself. Myself and two other people were walking her home, and some dudes opened fire on us with shotguns from the bushes. We found out later the gunsmen were black policemen. I was hit. They were shooting at us a long time, and after I got hit, I dove to the ground, rolled over, and made my way over to a ditch and went into somebody's yard. After the shooting, there was a lot of commotion. People went out in the street and just started tearing everything up. And a few hours later, they burned the school again. 2 weeks before I came over and spoke, people had burned the black elementary school because it had been a rat-infested, roach-infested place. People were paying their tax dollars, and the students were forced to go to school in that condition. It was terrible, man. Conditions caused riots, not rhetoric, end quote. The aftermath. Pine Street Elementary School, along with 2 blocks of homes and businesses, went up in flames. Brown disappeared, some say concealed in a coffin and driven out of Cambridge in a hearse. Maryland State Police and the FBI issued warrants for his arrest. 2 days later, he was arrested by FBI agents in Washington, D.C.'s National Airport and charged with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. 3 weeks later, the state of Maryland charged Brown with inciting to riot. Freed on $100,000 bond, Brown continued to speak boldly to the nation. In 1967, within hearing distance of the White House in Washington, D.C., he roared, quote, "If you're going to loot, loot yourself a gun store. You got to arm yourself, brother." In Detroit, he declared violence is as American as cherry pie. This is a quote enshrined in Bartlett's familiar quotations. This country has delivered an ultimatum to black people. America says to blacks, you either fight to live or you will live to die. I say to America, freedom or death. By 1968, much of SNCC's leadership had merged into the Black Panther Party, which had been organized in Oakland, California, by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. The Black Panthers called for neighborhood control of such services as education and the police. More importantly, they supported the use of guns for self-defense and to protect the oppressed. The FBI labeled them, quote, the most dangerous and violence-prone of all extremist groups, end quote. Brown became the Panthers' Minister of Justice. In December of 1969, a police raid on Panther headquarters in Chicago resulted in the deaths of 2 Black Panther leaders. Police riddled the apartment with bullets in a controversial show of force. Earlier the same year, Seale and other Panthers had been charged with killing a suspected informer. And let me just say, those 2 um, murdered Panthers who were murdered by a phalanx of heavily armed Chicago police in the middle of the night. One in bed with his pregnant fiancee was Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. These were the two Panthers that were murdered in the middle of the night by Chicago police. Getting back to the read. An undeclared war was being waged against the Panthers. Brown's attorney, William Kunstler, who also defended the Chicago Seven and other Black Panthers, delayed Brown's trial for 2 years. Scheduled to appear on March 10th, 1970 for trial, Brown did not appear. That night, two of his associates, Ralph Featherstone and William Payne, were killed when a bomb exploded in their car. At the rescheduled date of his trial, May 4th, 1970, Brown again failed to appear. 2 days later, the FBI listed Brown as one of its most wanted fugitives. Brown eluded the FBI for a year and a half. On October 16th, 1971, he surfaced. With 3 supporters who had joined him, he led an attack on a New York City bar targeted for exploitation of the community, and word on the street labeled it as a drug den. A shootout with police ensued, and Brown was wounded, captured, and taken to the detention facilities at Rikers Island. Behind bars, awaiting his trial, he recalls that the Muslims would come inside the prison and they would have services on Friday. They extended an invitation for me to come down to the services, and I attended. I came down to Jummah, but I didn't become a Muslim at first. In the struggle, we were familiar with Islam in different ways because there was a lot of conversation in the media of Malcolm X, his odyssey from early life to being a Muslim when he died. He was a visible image, and I'm sure his conversion to true Islam had an impact on many different people. It made me look at Islam even more seriously than I would have. I began to ask myself, in terms of what they are talking about, what's wrong with it? I couldn't find anything wrong. It caused me to investigate even more, which required my becoming a Muslim. According to Brother Jamil, end quote, according to Brother Jamil, becoming a Muslim was no more than a continuation of a lifestyle, he said. Most people don't have a true picture of what Islam is. Islam is not nonviolent. There is a right to self-defense, and there is a right to defend your faith. Allah says that fighting is prescribed for you. Fight tyranny and oppression, for tyranny and oppression are worse than slaughter. So fight them wherever you may find them. End quote. It became evident that to accomplish the things we had talked about in the struggle, you would need a practice. Allah says he does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is within themselves. That is what Islam does. And it points out right from wrong. It points out truth from falsehood. End quote. H. Rap Brown made his declaration of faith in late 1971. Henceforth, his name would be Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin. He was to remain in prison at Rikers Island until 1972, when he was moved to a jail in Long Island City and then to the Tombs. His trial for armed robbery and assaulting a police officer was finally brought to court in 1973. It was a strange fare for a jury to digest, beginning as it did with a prayer and ending enigmatically with a poem. Before a hushed courtroom crowd, H. Rap Brown took his lawyer's place to deliver the opening statement. In blue jeans and a beige knit skull cap, he stood quietly, and his head bowed for several moments, palms extended heavenward, murmuring a Muslim prayer. This is a description given to us from Newsweek magazine on February 12th, 1973. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in Attica State Prison. But after 3 years in various state prisons, Brother Jamil won parole in 1976. His total jail and prison time was 5 years, including 2 years in jail prior to sentencing. He resettled in Atlanta and soon organized a small community of Muslims. With pooled resources of the brothers and sisters, a small house was purchased on the West End Place to serve as the masjid. Brother Jamil was selected as imam. He had studied intensely, learned Quran and Sunnah, and of course, his leadership qualities were still intact. The Atlanta community would grow to a number around 400 members, with businesses and 2 published lots adjacent to the masjid, with the intent to house a larger masjid, a community center, and an Islamic school. Imam Jamil Al-Amin stresses, however, that, quote, any building is just an edifice. The mosque is built to make prayer. Prayer is the key to the community, not buildings. The Islamic program is built around the making of prayer. And we've been able to establish and maintain the prayer, end quote. Then he went on to say, Allah has allowed me to understand that it is not race or color that is the issue. The only important thing is the word of Allah. Since Islam, I understand that truth is not relative. Truth is universal. There is no God but Allah. It is the truth on which the whole universe rests, and nothing changes that. Now, a number of these quotes came from a very special report that was published in the city paper. Brothers and sisters, I wanted to share that with you in conclusion of today's broadcast as a reminder that this very important figure, this very important Muslim, this very important personality within America's modern history of struggle for human rights, for justice for all, for equality, for the things that this country theoretically is supposed to stand for, and what it trumpets around the world as its quote unquote values. This man who challenged from his days as H. Rap Brown to his embrace of Islam and his transformation into Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin. This man who has championed the cause of truth and the cause of justice for all, the cause of really doing as much as he possibly can to bring about a revolution of values in this experiment called the United States of America. He is still imprisoned. He is a political prisoner, now locked down for over 20 years. And he needs our support. He is one of the symbols of what so many people in the street have been out struggling for, justice for all. He is a symbol of this struggle. And for our Muslim brethren and for our African American brethren, he is our brother. He is our brother, and we have a special obligation to him and to doing as much as we possibly can to see him taste freedom again and become himself an active part of this struggle. I'll conclude with this. Given Imam Jamil's stellar record of service to his community and to the community at large, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, that if Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin had not been imprisoned for the past 20 years, I really don't believe that conditions in the Black community would be as dire as they are, especially as it pertains to the Black on Black fratricide in our communities. I really believe that the Muslim community would be much further along, much further advanced on the organized front than what it is today if he had not been silenced for the past 20 years. So from a perspective of brotherhood, as well as from a perspective of our needs, our very basic human rights oriented needs during this unique moment that we are in as a nation and as a world, we need to do as much as we possibly can to get this brother back on the streets, back in the community, back with his family where he belongs. And with that said, I want to conclude with a thank you for hanging in with me for this this extra bit of presentation on this Salam Media platform today, and I pray to Allah that it was worth your time. I want to thank the engineers at Salam Media for hanging in with us today, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless the efforts of us all. May Allah ta'ala put barakah into everything that we do in His name. May Allah ta'ala purify the work that we're doing and make it fruitful in this life and the next. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.